emotions, intuitions, and morality.
Well, thank you so much, Dan, for the introduction and for the invitation to give a talk. It's really a pleasure to be here. Now, I wonder, is the microphone working actually? Yeah, okay, great. Right, so I'll be talking about emotions and various issues related to morality. And historically, if we look back in terms of philosophy, the question of how people tell right from wrong has been approached from mostly two camps, two opposing camps. On one hand, the view that when people put a lot of thought into a certain question of a behavior, whether it's acceptable or not, when they think long and hard, when they consider all the pros and cons, then they decide whether something is right or wrong. That goes back to Kant's contribution, versus, on the other hand, David Hume proposed that it's not so much thoughts and rationality, but what he termed sentiments or feelings that determine how people tell right from wrong. So that was as far as philosophy is concerned. Then within psychology, for a long time, the predominant view was coming also from this more reasoning-based perspective that morality and deciding what's right and wrong depends on thought processes. And Kohlberg in particular proposed that as children develop, they progress through various stages of moral development, and only once they've reached the final stage, they're capable of making sophisticated moral judgments. And that kind of view has been criticized for various reasons, one being that many people, in fact, never reach that critical phase. So it's questionable how they actually make moral decisions. Now, more recently, my colleague and collaborator, Jonathan Haidt, proposed, following in the footsteps of David Hume, that it is moral intuitions or certain feelings or sentiments that determine moral judgments. And he proposed that intuition is the driving force behind moral judgment, and then when people do engage in thought processes, it's often like an afterthought or a process that only follows as a consequence of having made the decision based on a quick gut feeling or an intuition. So Haidt proposed a somewhat complex model of moral judgment that also has a social component. He calls it the social intuitionist model. So far, the social aspect of it, how people influence one another in terms of their moral views, has not really received that much empirical testing. But what we've tested in particular is the basic notion that a person's intuition, a person A's own intuition, changes their own judgment. And then, as I said, there can be additional social processes and also reasoning processes involved, but we tested this most basic link, that when one has a certain gut feeling, a certain intuition, that can drive one's judgment in a causal manner. So what is this moral intuition? The way Haidt defines it is as the sudden appearance in consciousness of a moral judgment, including an affective valence, without any conscious awareness of having gone through steps of searching, weighing evidence, or inferring a conclusion. So an important part is that this feeling or this intuition just comes to you without necessarily having gone through a lot of cognitive consideration or rational consideration. So it's not so much based on real arguments or reasons, but on some sort of gut feeling that comes to people automatically. And this automatic component is actually also quite important, that it's not a deliberate process, but something that just happens and people don't really have a lot of control over it. And oftentimes it has some affective or emotional valence. So what might these specific intuitions be? Now, one intuition that we've looked at in our work is the gut feeling of disgust. So disgust originated as an emotion that relates to food consumption. So usually when food doesn't look good or doesn't smell good, then people want to stay away from it. So in that sense, it's very adaptive to experience disgust in response to food consumption. It's also present whenever other contaminant substances are in the environment and one has to avoid touching them or being in contact with potentially harmful substances. So in a way, disgust is a very basic emotion. So it originates from avoiding and not touching things that could be potentially harmful. But it has also been proposed by Haidt, Rosen and colleagues that the same sense of disgust that one gets with spoiled food or disgusting objects is also experienced when one deals with disgusting people or disgusting action. So when another person does something objectionable, then people experience disgust. So in a way, it has been proposed that there is some sort of conflation between physical disgust and moral disgust, and the two are on some level interchangeable. And if that is the case, then it should be possible to experimentally induce a sense of disgust in participants and have a subsequent influence on moral judgments. And that's exactly what we did in our work. So when we started looking at these influences of disgust on morality, there wasn't really a lot of work, or there weren't many good manipulations of disgust. In the literature, there had been some work on involving hypnosis, but that has various issues in terms of trying to interpret what the effect is due to. So my collaborator on this, Alex Jordan, he cleverly noticed that one can obtain stimuli that are really disgusting, and they're commercially available, such as in the form of a fart spray. And what we then simply did was to expose participants to that smell, that disgusting smell, while they were making moral judgments. So while they were considering whether certain transgressions were wrong, there happened to be a bad smell in the environment. So this was done in an outdoor location. We had participants sit on campus at a table where there was a trash can nearby, and we either sprayed it with that disgusting spray or not. So we had two conditions, either a mild stink or a strong stink, and a neutral control condition. And in each case, participants answered certain moral questions. So they considered situations such as these. Your friend has been trying to find a job for quite some time, and he's getting really desperate. Now he's falsifying some information on his CV. He finally manages to get a job. How wrong was it for him to falsify his CV? And participants can answer that it's on a scale from it's perfectly okay to extremely wrong. So the idea is, how wrong is it to you as a participant to do certain things? So one would be falsifying your CV, another would be not returning a lost wallet, and we had various other such questions. Now, what we find is that in the conditions where participants were exposed to the disgusting smell, they considered these moral transgressions to be more wrong. So, and I should point out, it didn't matter whether there was just a little bit of that bad smell or a lot of it. In either case, there was some disgust in the air, literally, and people took that feeling of disgust that they were experiencing to be relevant about the moral transgression they were considering. So in a way, they engaged in a misattribution of a feeling that was there and in fact totally irrelevant to the transgression. But it's as if they realized that something is disgusting. Well, what could it be? It's this action of falsifying a CV, not returning a lost wallet, and so on. That is disgusting and therefore wrong. So we find this effect of this gut feeling of disgust. And I should say, we also had additional studies. For example, in one of the studies, we had a lab. It didn't quite look that bad, but it looked pretty bad, where we set up the lab to be disgusting. The table was all sticky, and the chair had, various things stuck to it, and we had trash lying around. It didn't look too different from a usual lab, but we made it look very bad and made the reverse, the control condition, look really clean or really tidy. So we had a disgusting desk study, one with a disgusting film clip, or another study with recalling a disgusting life event. So in all these studies, we get similar effects where people, when they feel disgusted due to something in the environment or due to something they thought of, some sort of stimulus that elicits disgust, they find moral transgressions more wrong. And I should point out, it's not just an effect of negative affect, such that other emotions such as sadness don't create the effect. And interestingly enough, we find that the effect is primarily there for participants who are generally sensitive to their bodily sensations. So when somebody is really in tune with these gut feelings, so for example, when they report on an independent scale that they're really sensitive to, or that they notice easily when their throat gets dry when they're thirsty, or when their stomach contracts when they're hungry, people who are high on that scale are especially prone to be influenced by the disgust manipulation. So I should point out that, you know, it hasn't just been our work, but then other colleagues and research labs have basically replicated the general effect that there is a link between physical disgust and moral disgust, that somehow they can get conflated when people think of moral situations. And in particular, David Pissarro has done a lot of work looking at individual differences in disgust sensitivity. So people who are generally prone to experience disgust on a regular basis, they use those feelings when they make moral judgments or when they consider moral situations. So there's now quite a bit of work that points to that link of physical disgust and moral disgust. Now, I should say that on one hand, we've looked at this, well, when one considers morality and disgust metaphorically, there is the dirt and contamination side on one hand, but on the other side of the spectrum, the opposite would be cleanliness and purity. And we reason that if it's true that on one hand feeling disgusted makes people more severe when they make moral judgments, then the opposite should be the case, and the judgment should be less severe when they feel clean and pure. And this was to some extent based on work by Chenbo Chong and colleagues. They discovered what they call the Macbeth effect, where they've shown that when people consider past moral transgressions, when they're reminded of bad things they've done in the past, then they show a desire for cleansing-related behaviors. They want to wash their hands, they want to wipe their hands, and they think of more words related to cleanliness. So for example, in one of their studies, they showed in a word completion task that people who had thought of an unethical deed, they were more likely to complete word fragments such as these with wash, shower, and soap, rather than, for example, wish, well, and various other words, so control words, which now I can seem to think of. So it seems like there is not only a connection between disgust and morality, but also cleanliness and morality. And what we then did in our work was to use this reasoning to see whether experienced cleanliness can, in the same way as disgust, influence moral judgment. So in one of our studies, we simply primed concepts related to cleanliness in a scrambled sentences task, and then again gave participants moral questions to answer, again issues such as somebody's falsifying their CV, somebody's not returning a lost wallet. And we find that when people are primed with cleanliness concepts, they find these transgressions to be less wrong than when they're primed with neutral concepts. We've done follow-ups with actual hand washing as well. So for example, in one study, participants first were induced to feel disgust with a clip from Train Spotting that has been pre-tested to be disgusting, and then they were given the choice to either wash their hands or not, or rather they were assigned to conditions where they could either wash their hands or not. And the way we did that was to first they watched the film clip, the Train Spotting clip, in another room, then were brought to a room that they were told was the staff room that needed to be kept clean and tidy, and we made it look somewhat nicer than usual for the cover story. And importantly, for half the participants, we asked them to go over to the sink and wash their hands with water and soap before they sat down at the table, supposedly because it was the staff room and it needed to be kept clean and tidy. And participants, except for one, complied. So as they were told to wash their hands, they did. And we find that, again, when people felt, or participants felt clean relative to being in a not so clean state after having watched the Disgust clip, their moral judgments were less severe. So they consider transgressions such as not returning a lost wallet to be less bad. Now, there have also been replications and extensions of this work. In particular, Spike Lee and Norbert Schwartz, they actually noticed in our studies, in the studies that I just described, that these hand-washing effects were especially pronounced for transgressions involving the hands, doing something with the hands. So what they then subsequently showed was that these cleansing desires are modality specific. So if participants had said something, verbally said something bad, they were more attracted, or they found mouthwash more attractive, whereas if they had done something bad with their hands, like typing a message that was was on some level objectionable. They were they had a greater desire to use hand sanitizer. And again, Chenbo, Chong, and colleagues, they've shown that even a clean smell can have consequences for more morality-related behavior. So they find that in a clean-smelling room, people are more likely to engage in helping behavior. So it seems like there's something really interesting going on with disgust on one hand and cleanliness on the other hand, this general dimension or this general intuition of purity. And in fact, Spike Lee and Norbert Schwartz showed that it's not only relating to morality, but in general, one can wash away various feelings with hand washing. For example, one can get rid of cognitive dissonance that way, or one can also wash away positive states. So they've shown, for example, when people feel they have a lucky streak, they wash away that streak when they cleanse their hands. So it seems like there's something really physical about the kind of, well, physical or something permanent about things we hold on to versus getting rid of them when we wash our hands and cleanse ourselves. And I have recently proposed that perhaps cleanliness is not so much about how one feels about the self in terms of moral considerations, but perhaps there's a social component such that cleanliness could be an indicator of positive social contacts, because it is well known that primates spend a lot of time doing social grooming, and this social grooming then relates to positive social relationships. So in a way, it's possible that when an individual is well groomed, that could be an indicator of having positive social relationships. So it's not just something good for the self because oneself feels clean and moral and pure, but it could also send a positive signal to others about being a good cooperative partner because one literally has other people come close and one engages in close contact with others. So that's a speculation at this point. But some more direct things we tested were, these ideas of washing away one's own sins and one's own transgressions. I should point out that following our paper where we show that that feelings of cleanliness lead to less severe moral judgments, Chenbo, Zhang, and colleagues, they actually got an opposite effect where they find that when people feel clean, they engage in more harsh moral judgments. And I think when I looked at the stimuli, I think it can be explained through the fact that it depends on what the feeling or what the cleanliness is about. So in our case, it was really about the transgression, so the behavior feels clean and appropriate, whereas if it's the self, if I feel clean and the other person did something really bad, that establishes a contrast, and therefore whatever the other person did is all the more wrong. So there's some interesting directions going on, but the crucial point here is that something like hand washing can be surprisingly effective in terms of moral outcomes. Now, as far as these moral intuitions go, we now have quite a bit of evidence on this dimension of purity that disgust on one hand versus cleanliness on the other hand has an influence on moral outcomes. Graham and colleagues proposed a number of such moral intuitions. So for example, they talk about harm as a very basic component in judgments of whether something is wrong. So clearly when somebody is violated or experiences some harm, that is wrong. Fairness is usually also a fairly obvious consideration. Whereas the other three intuitions that Graham and colleagues identified, in-group, loyalty, authority, and purity, they're more these kinds of gut feelings or these sense, well, where it's not necessarily a rational thing to follow the intuition, or not, it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense, for example, to influence by purity considerations. And what we've done more recently with my postdoc, Peter Cannon, we actually looked specifically whether all these 5 foundations have some sort of affective responses associated with them. And what we did was to expose participants to moral transgressions or moral statements, and we measured whether there are, when they're considering these moral situations, whether they're automatic affective responses. So what we did here was to first measure, well, activity in 3 different muscles. One is the corrugator that furrows the brow in terms of frowning and is associated with anger and negative affect. An important one for us is the levator, which pulls up the nose in disgust. And then the Zygomaticus at the corners of the mouth is simply involved in smiling. So that was more or less a control muscle that we also wanted to keep track of, but we expected real activity for the frowning and for the disgust, for this negative affect, as a function of being confronted with moral transgressions. So what we did was to basically wire up people like that, except that they also had electrodes on the nose to measure the levator activity. And then we presented participants with a variety of statements that were either positive or negative and involved one of the 5 foundations. So harm, on the positive dimension, somebody gave a blanket and a hot meal to a homeless person, versus on the negative, somebody tortured a stray cat, and so on. So there we had a whole set of such stimuli, roughly, I think it was 10 in each, so we had quite a variety, and participants simply listened to these sentences, such as these. They were listening on headphones to these statements, and we recorded first the EMG baseline, and then how their facial muscles responded as they were considering these behaviors. So they were simply instructed, think about this behavior, and then in a second block, they were presented with all these same moral statements again, and in this case, they actually rated them in terms of how positive or negative they were. So in the first block, we simply measured their affective responses to these moral behaviors. In the second block, we got their moral judgment, and then eventually we combined the two. So as far as the muscle activity goes, we find that for the levator muscle, and this is again the muscle that pulls up the nose in disgust, we find the highest level of activity for the purity foundation. So as people are considering violations of the purity foundation, they show a lot of activity on the levator. And I should say the dark gray bars are items that are on the negative rather than the positive dimension. For fairness, there's also quite a bit of activity, and to some extent for harm. And then authority and in-group, there is not really much going on. Now, if we move on to the corrugator, so corrugator furrows the brow and frowning, we find quite a bit of activity for the purity foundation again, and also for the harm foundation. Not much goes on with the remaining foundations. And again, this is for the negative statements, as opposed to actually a relaxation, almost like a positive response on the corrugator as far as positive behaviors concerning concerning purity are concerned. And then finally, for the Zygomaticus, for smiling, there is not really much of activity in response to those situations. Now, as I said, so this is just how people spontaneously respond when they are confronted with these moral behaviors. But then we also looked at how they actually judge those behaviors later on. So we correlated the muscle activity and the moral judgment, and we find, first of all, for the levator, there's a high negative correlation for activity and on the purity foundation. So negative correlation meaning the higher the activity, the more negative the judgment. Similarly, for the fairness foundation, we find a negative correlation with the levator. We find one for the corrugator and purity, and also harm. And I should say, unexpectedly, we find a positive correlation for the in-group items, such that the more positive these items, the more positive they were considered, the more smiling activity there was for these in-group items. And we get an initially surprising correlation for the Zygomaticus in purity, but that actually is to some extent due to the levator activity, because as you pull up the nose, you also pull up to some extent the corners of the mouth. And when we control for levator activity, which is really high, we actually get rid of that correlation. So the Zygomaticus really only seems to be involved in these in-group judgments. So we are positively disposed towards behaviors that people do in loyalty of their own group. Right, so all this work that I've described so far deals with moral judgment and how people decide whether something is right and wrong. And it also mostly deals with the negative dimension of being repulsed or being outraged and feeling bad or feeling negative about other people's transgressions. But what we've also looked at recently is the extent to which moral behaviors are influenced by moral intuitions. And for this, we've primarily been looking at positive emotions. This is in collaboration with Dan Fessler here at UCLA. We've been looking at the moral emotion of elevation, and that is, according to Haidt, in a way, it's the opposite of disgust. So the things I've talked to you about so far, how physical disgust and this repulsion of witnessing somebody do something really bad elicits disgust. If we now witness somebody do something morally outstanding and positive, we are experiencing elevation. So elevation is the experience that one has when witnessing acts of moral beauty. So according to Haidt's description, one feels moved, uplifted, one has a warm feeling in the chest, and importantly, according to this idea, people also feel inspired to do something good themselves. So in a way, if you feel really positive and inspired by having seen somebody else do something good, you then also want to go and do something good yourself. And that has been, well, the hypothesis, and it hadn't been tested actually. So Dan and I and my student Jean Roper, we tested the idea whether it's really true that this moral feeling of elevation, this being uplifted in response to an act of moral beauty, whether that really inspires people to do good things themselves. And importantly, it would have to be above and beyond just general positive affect, because it is known already that when people feel good, they're sometimes more likely to help. So it should be not just feeling good and helping, but feeling morally inspired and then helping. So we used a clip that lends itself very well for these purposes. It's by Oprah. So I'm just going to
Marcellus doesn't know the real reason he's here is because someone he inspired wants to pay tribute to you. Someone you inspired wants to pay tribute to you. Take a look.
Marcellus Brown. You know, I thought he was like one of the coolest people that I had ever met. He treated me like a human being that had the potential to grow. So, you know, I was inspired to be just like him. What Marcellus did to me, he saved my life. I grew up in Chicago on the west side. My most vivid memory is trying to make mud pies and feed them to my sisters because there was no food in the house. And I'd gone down the street begging neighbors for food. I just felt like I had to run and hide in shame most of my entire life. I've seen people murdered. I bought a gun. I thought I was going to be a drug dealer.
But one day, while visiting a friend at Chicago State University, Fernando had a chance meeting with Marcellus Brown, the school's band director. It was an encounter that would change the course of Fernando's life. Marcellus heard him play the trumpet and offered him a scholarship.
I was just so excited that Marcellus would take the time and show some interest in me that I said, okay, I want to go to college.
But Marcellus didn't just help Fernando with his music.
Marcellus was my first father figure. He inspired me. He showed me how to write. He showed me how to eat at a table, you know, what utensils to use. He knows the right words to touch a person to motivate them to do what they need to do.
After graduation, Fernando moved to Los Angeles and began to make a career for himself as a musician.
I played with some of the artists that I just dreamed about. Played on The Tonight Show, Saturday Night Live. I just had a great time, but my real passion was teaching, and I really wanted to be able to give people what I was given.
Fernando landed a job as a high school band director in troubled South Central Los Angeles.
My first year, I was just a total failure. I wanted to quit every week. What I had to eventually do was become myself and open myself up and tell people where I had come from, and they were shocked. But they understood why I was pushing them so hard.
Actually, it goes on and on for quite some time. I'm just going to show you the ending real quick here. Oh, wait, sorry. One back. Here.
I would just like to say thank you to Marcellus Brown for giving me an opportunity to reach out and help other people. Thank you for believing in me, giving me a life that I would not have had. Thank you very much.
Brown, come on up here. Surprise. Fernando, put 'em on out here. That's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing.
Okay, it's actually much longer and it goes on, but I'm going to spare you. But the idea is that there was we had this clip where somebody did something good for another person, behaved in an unselfish way, and it is in some way moving, and we know that it moves participants, and we hope it would get them to also engage in prosocial behavior. So what we did, and this again was with Dan collaboration, we had in our experiments, we first showed them the video clip, either Oprah or a neutral clip, which was just a nature documentary. And supposedly it was a study about memory. So then they were asked to write about what they had just seen. And then under pretext, the experimenter leaves the room, but that gives them an opportunity to fill out the form that says they received the payment, so they get the payment as well. So we make it very obvious to them that they're now getting paid for the study. But the important component here is that they get a choice to say whether they would like to participate in an unpaid study. So the idea is that it's very salient that they only came to do the study because they were paid for it, but now would they come back for an unpaid study? And we also get a manipulation check at the end where they complete how they felt after watching the film clip. And first of all, we find that for the elevation clip, people are much higher on feeling moved, feeling uplifted, being optimistic about humanity, having a warm feeling in the chest, and wanting to help others, and wanting to become a better person. So that's all relative to just having watched a somewhat mildly positive nature documentary. So it seems like people really do feel this sensation of what we call moral elevation. Now, importantly, we then look at how they behave or what they indicate in terms of their intention of completing an unpaid study. And we find that for the elevation condition, we get a much higher proportion of people, and this is here in the green bar, saying that they agreed to do a study that is unpaid compared to the neutral condition. So of course, on some level, we don't really know what would happen with actual behavior from this study. We don't know if it's just positive affect, and we had a categorical variable rather than measuring something on a more finer continuous scale. So in our next study, we had, in addition to the Oprah and the OpenSea, the nature documentary clip, we had a positive clip from Fawlty Towers, a British comedy show, and pretty much followed the same design. First the film clip, then writing about the task, but then we introduced a new measure that was developed by Bartlett and DeSteno. They had a whole situation rigged up where a computer fails in the study. Participant is told, oh, now we have to stop the study. You can go home. You're free to leave. And then almost as an after fact, the experimenter then says, oh, but wait, I have these really boring math questionnaires. It would help me out a great deal if you could complete some of them. You don't have to, but it would be really helpful. So that's what we did. And we had participants come in for a 1-hour study, so they knew, in principle, after those 15 minutes of just having watched the film clip and having done the first part of the study, they could have left. But the important question was, to what extent would they be willing to stay back and help the experimenter and fill out these boring math questionnaires? And we considered this a form of helping and prosocial behavior. So first of all, just to look at how people felt as a function of these clips, and to importantly distinguish elevation from just positive affect and feeling good and being amused and entertained. People in the elevation and amusement condition both feel happy, but amusement, of course, is only there for amusement. But this important component of elevation, of being moved, that's only there for elevation. The warm feeling in the chest is only there for elevation. Feeling uplifted is there for elevation, being optimistic about humanity, and importantly, this idea of wanting to become a better person yourself and wanting to help others. So we find these critical components of elevation only for the elevation condition, but not the positive affect, the humor condition. Now, when we look at how long people actually stayed to help the experimenter complete the boring questionnaires, we find that for the neutral and the mirth or amusement condition, people stayed on average for another 20 or 25 minutes. So they were paid for an hour. They finished after 15 minutes in principle, but then spent another 20, 25 minutes. But for the elevation condition, they on average spent another 40 minutes completing the questionnaires. And to be honest, we were really shocked how long they would just sit and fill out question after question and turn page after page. They would, I mean, sometimes we had a really thick pack that we thought, okay, we just have a lot for them to complete if they want to. And in the elevation condition, that was really necessary to have that much of material for them. So basically, when people feel inspired by this film clip where somebody does something positive for another person, they themselves feel inspired to do something good. Yes, we have a question here.
So what was the condition under which they were, did they just say, I can go, I want to go now? Like, how was the session terminated?
Right, so they were told, unfortunately, we cannot continue the study, you're now free to go, and the experimenter would wait until participants are ready, basically packing up and getting ready to leave, and then she would say, oh, by the way, you know, I have these other questionnaires, so if you don't mind, you know, it would be great if you could fill out some.
Once they started on the questionnaires,
Yes.
40 minutes finishing the whole packet, or?
No, that wasn't the whole packet, but the maximum, I'm not sure what the maximum would have been, but yeah, what this is basically times the time in minutes that was surreptitiously measured by the experimenter.
So they just said, I've done enough, I want to go now. And they
Oh, I see. Sorry. Yeah, okay. Right, exactly. So they could just, because it was made clear by the experimenter that whatever they wanted to do would be helpful and they could stop at any point. So they would then just turn it back to the experiment and say they're finished. Right, so, but again, the important thing is that on some level, when people feel inspired and they have seen somebody else do something good for another person, they then take this feeling and apply it in that relevant context that they find themselves in. So it wasn't just a sense of modeling or doing exactly the same thing that the other person did, but doing something good in a completely different context. Yes? Yes, that was fixed. Exactly. Sorry, I didn't mention that. They were also told they would get payment or participation credit, whatever it was. They would get that anyway. So they got whatever. I mean, it was made very clear that they had completed everything they needed to do. Now, it was also interesting that the feelings that participants reported as a function of the manipulation, such as feeling moved, uplifted, the warm feeling in the chest, being optimistic about humanity, wanting to be a good person, wanting to help others, all these were significantly correlated with the time they spent on that questionnaire. So the more they felt uplifted and inspired, the longer they actually spent helping the experimenter, whereas there were no correlations for just feeling amused or feeling happy. So it's not just a case of feeling good makes people help, but there's something special about this sense of elevation. And now, one important question that I've been testing more recently is, well, why one gets this effect. So we show that people, when they feel elevated, they do good things for others as well. But is there some kind of more, well, some negative component to that, in the sense that when I am confronted with a moral exemplar, I then feel bad about myself and I realize, oh, you know, maybe compared to that person, I'm really lacking in morality, so I better do something good. And there has been this observation of what's called the moral licensing effect. For example, Monine and Miller, Sachdeva and colleagues, they find that when people are given a chance to assert their own morality and to confirm that they're good people, then they, on the next occasion, they actually do less, for example, engage in less prosocial behavior or do less good things because they already confirmed that they're a morally good person. So it's possible, or at least that was the question, it's possible that the helping effect of moral elevation is simply due to the fact that people feel threatened to some extent or that they feel they don't live up to a certain standard. So what we did in another study was to test this idea by giving participants a chance for for self-affirmation. So we instructed them to write about a recent experience in which they demonstrated one of their most personally valued qualities and felt good about themselves. And that could be a number of things such as artistic skill, sense of humor, athletic ability, and so on. So we instructed participants to basically remind themselves that they have positive qualities. And in the control condition, we simply told them to write about something neutral, like the journey from home to the university. So the question was whether reminding yourself that that you have positive qualities, that you're a good person, whether that would then actually get rid of the helping effect of moral elevation. So here is what we did. It was pretty much the same paradigm as before, with a film clip, either Oprah versus neutral, the writing task, the computer crash, and then the math questionnaires. But what we added here at the beginning was the self-affirmation task for half the participants. So half the participants reminded themselves that they were pretty decent people. And we find, now interestingly, first of all, we find for the self-affirmation in the control condition, that's the light gray bars, when people had self-affirmed their positive qualities, they engaged in less helping behavior. And for the elevation condition, after self-affirmation, there was no expected or no potential, no drop that could have been expected in the helping behavior such that the effect goes away. But people still, when they were experiencing moral elevation, after they had self-affirmed, they engaged in quite a bit of helping behavior. Now, as you will notice, the effect was not significantly different for elevation and self-affirmation versus no self-affirmation, but it actually was the case that when we inspected the narratives that participants produced, that some had actually affirmed qualities that dealt with prosocial social behavior. So when we looked at the content of participants' self-affirmation, so again, this is the control condition with no affirmation, people who had actually affirmed a prosocial previous behavior or their prosocial qualities, they engaged in the most helping behavior relative to other participants. Those who had affirmed somewhat more selfish, I mean, well, not really selfish, but certainly not prosocial qualities, such as being good at sports and having certain abilities, they also showed quite a bit of helping. But overall, what this suggests is that it's not the case that people engage in helping as a function of moral elevation because they feel bad about themselves, because we showed that, in fact, when they were reminded of their own moral values and the fact that they had done things that were prosocial in the past, they then acted on this in the helping situation. Did you have a question? Oh, sorry. Okay, right. So in a way, I mean, the way we interpret this is that through this self-affirmation, participants reminded themselves of their moral values, and then when given this manipulation with elevation, it inspired them and it kind of provided the motivation for them to actually act on those values. So in a way, it's not the case that this helping effect is due to people feeling bad or some moral licensing, that they just want to make themselves feel better and therefore engage in good behavior. Now, most recently, I've also been working with Mary Helen Imordino-Yang, and we've been looking at some of these consequences of putting moral values into action. So she and her colleagues had shown that there are different moral correlates for elevation versus admiration. So admiration is the emotion one experiences after witnessing special skills or special abilities. So elevation is basically the experience one has in response to moral excellence, whereas admiration is just general excellence or a special skill that doesn't have a moral component. So in a way, the two are very similar because it's about judging another person's exceptional behaviors or exceptional skill, but one has a moral component, namely elevation, but admiration does not. But it turns out they're very different emotions on a neural level. And we're now also finding that when we specifically compare how people report when they're experiencing elevation versus admiration, there are very strong differences. For example, in terms of the kind of values they report. So with elevation, it makes people focus on their own values. They think about things more abstractly with a higher level of construal. And they also engage in nonverbal behaviors that indicate some kind of tuning out from the immediate situation. So for example, they avert their gaze more often than people who experience admiration. So there seems to be all kinds of interesting correlates of, well, what people do when they think of some really positive, morally positive person rather than somebody who just has an exceptional skill. And that brings me to the conclusion that, well, we find that these various moral intuitions have effects on judgments, moral judgments, such that physical disgust makes judgments more severe, cleanliness makes them less severe. We find that when people listen to moral transgressions, that elicits specific facial affect, which then predicts moral judgment. We find, as far as behavior is concerned, that moral elevation inspires prosocial behavior, and there's now more and more evidence that morality involves emotional processes rather than just rational thinking. So coming back to the debate that Kant and Hume somewhat started, it now looks like Hume is really, well, more right than, for example, Kant. Certainly the research that's been done in our lab suggests that's the case. And yeah, on that note, I'd like to finish and thank my collaborators, funding sources, and the students involved in the work. Thank you.